Kevin, thank you so much for coming. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here with me today. For those who might not have met you before or might not be so familiar with your work, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Natalie. So my name is Kevin Arnaud. I am a Canadian psychologist. I suppose this is an international forum. I'll just put my phone. Sorry about that. So Canadian psychologist. I'm located in Edmonton, Alberta. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at the Concordia University of Edmonton. I'm very interested in existential psychology. I have been throughout my entire trajectory through psychology and now into this professorship. I formerly worked in psychosocial oncology and palliative care for a number of years. And my research pertains to existential themes, particularly death anxiety, self-transcendence, and the notion of psychological maturity and how those themes all interact. You can throw in there as well my interest in the serotonergic psychedelic substances, because I believe that they have a very profound role to play in advancing existential psychology and related topics. So that's, I guess, a quick overview.
Amazing. And so I guess in this type of interview, a really great place to start is if we're discussing existential ideas, how do you describe them? How do you understand them?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. In many ways could be seen as a very difficult question. You could get into some real arcane kind of answers, but I think that it can be explained in a much more easy and basic way, which is really just, of course, kind of a very basic definition might be pertaining to existence. But okay, what does that mean? And so I like to think of existential ideas, existentialism, existential psychology as being concerned with the really big questions that humans face, the most profound or deepest of questions that humans can encounter, kind of like, why am I here? What is the point of this? What's the meaning of all of this? Why is there a universe and not, nothing, that kind of thing? Those are really, really deep questions about life, death, meaning, purpose. And then, of course, you get into Irvin Yalom's terms on freedom and responsibility and those kind of things. But I like to think it as the real base level, when you kind of peel the onion away of all of the kind of base level games we like to play about this and that and prestige and all that kind of human games, as Timothy Leary put it. What really is this about? And so these are eternal questions that I don't think that there will ever be final answers to. And I think that that's part of why they can be somewhat threatening, but also liberating. And so I think that this is one of the interesting dialectics with existential ideas, that there's a certain element of dread and fear and anxiety, but the flip side of that is a kind of, I would say, a liberation. But we can get into that because they can kind of get a little bit more complex. So that would be my first take at trying to define or explain a little bit about what existentialism or existential thinking is all about.
And you make the point there that existential thinking focuses on these big questions, but at the same time, these questions, in a sense, feel unanswerable. So how in your experience do these philosophies explore something that's unexplorable?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that, with existentialism, existential psychology, it's the grappling with the questions that is the point. It's not the answering of the questions. I think that if you look historically at the construct that we would perhaps call religion, or at least what William James would have called secondary religion, so kind of the codified religious systems in the world, that they are existential enterprises, that they try to grapple with these questions. And of course, many of these religions have tried to give answers to these questions. And that might be one of the distinguishing characteristics from existential philosophy and existential psychology from religions, let's say, is that existential psychology and philosophy deals with a lot of the similar questions that religions are contending with, but they don't purport to give a final answer. They explore the questions and at base get to this notion of, we can't forever come to a place of knowing and deciding upon the answer to these things. And I think that that's that's okay. And in fact, I think that's good. I think that that's a sign of the kind of evolution of culture broadly, to say that, you know, these are immense questions, and that coming to basic answers is perhaps a bit naive and perhaps a bit arrogant as well, in my perception, and that it lends, I guess, an element of maturity just to grapple with them and to come to this place of really a kind of what's been described as an enchanted agnosticism, which is a term that I really, really like, which is this idea of not knowing, finding this space in between, of not coming to a hard answer this way or that way, just saying, we can't know. And rather than that, you finding despair in that, or a kind of nihilism in that, finding this sense of awe and wonder in the mystery. And so that's what I think the response is, or the healthy response to these questions. And again, that's certainly my opinion, the opinion of some other authors out there. But yeah, so it's kind of finding balance, finding equanimity in the uncertainty, if that makes sense.
And you said that you have always been engaged in existential ideas throughout your kind of training and your career. But what led you to this in the first place? What led you
Yeah.
towards these ideas?
Yeah, so it's interesting now when I look back over my life. I think that in some way I was always, we might call it fate or destiny, and we can talk about Rollo May's distinction of those two terms because I think it's a relevant one. But when I look back, I can think one of my earliest memories was being a young child in my backyard, laying on the grass, looking up at the clouds going by, and just being in awe and wonder, and just pondering that as you know, as a 4-year-old. And I still can remember that. And then I have a memory at recess at school when I was in first or second grade, and I loved going on the swing set. Same thing on the swing set, just looking at the sun and the clouds going by, and pondering infinity, and kind of going through that infinite regress and getting to that sense of dread and awe of, well, what's beyond that? What's beyond that? And that sense of just, oh my God, that smallness, that sense of essentially unknowing, and coming against that wall of the limits of reason, the limits of logic, even as a kid. So I think in some sense, I've always kind of had this temperament or personality, if you will. But really formally, to answer your question, really it came when I took one of my very first introductory psychology classes as an undergraduate. And I was very, very fortunate that I had Dr. Jeff Schimmel as my instructor for that class. And Dr. Schimmel is a social psychologist who does research in terror management theory, which you may have heard of terror management theory. So terror management theory is within the broad paradigm, which is called experimental existential psychology. So it's social psychologists that are essentially doing all this research on mortality salience, or awareness of death, and how that unconsciously essentially impacts our behavior, our thoughts, our feelings, all sorts of kind of things. And it derives from the work of Ernest Becker, who was a cultural anthropologist who wrote some very famous books. One of them was The Denial of Death, and then Escape from Evil, and amongst another number of others. The Birth and Death of Meaning was another really great text. And so Jeff, in that introductory psychology class, he introduced us to his research and to the ideas of Becker and the ideas and the research being done in terror management theory. And that completely changed my life. Before then, I was studying biology, physics, biochemistry. I had originally wanted to become a physician. And this really changed my path. I saw that, wow, you could have one foot in the sciences and one foot in the humanities, and really kind of try to explore some of these very, very deep questions. And so my first introduction really to psychology, which was in my third year of my undergrad, was to Ernest Becker and to existential psychology. So right from the get-go. So I was really lucky that way. And really it's kind of continued in one form or another ever since then, this abiding interest in existential ideas.
Obviously you could have encountered it and may well have encountered it further down the line, but what came up for me there is how all it takes is that one person. I remember my first the first time that I remember hearing the word existential was with was from a lecturer as well, and it wasn't even during a class. I think I'd come to them with an issue outside in their office, and I remember they said, "Oh, it sounds like you are struggling with existential ideas. Have you looked into these philosophies?" And I just remember thinking, what a massive word. I don't know what you mean. Please continue. But it is true. It takes one person or one encounter for this whole door of existential thought to be opened up.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And I really, really credit and yeah, and thank Jeff for that class to this day. He was a really, really big influence on my life. And yeah, at a very important time in my life as well, where I was yeah, perhaps like yourself, I was starting to wrestle with some of these questions. I wasn't happy with my studies, and I was kind of bored with biology and biochemistry. I got the point, so to speak. I got it. Like, okay, yeah, we're biological organisms here on a planet that's whipping around a sun that's itself whipping around a massive black hole. Like, I got that the kind of physical science perspective. And from that, I kind of started to ask, what's the point? And right at that time in my life, happened to be taking this class. So it was also kind of interesting timing. And sometimes life works out that way too. So that opened the door, certainly.
Absolutely. What would you say it added to, or it built on from that baseline that you started?
Hmm. So yes, that's a good question. So I think that that really opened the door to studying psychology generally. So at that point, I was, as I mentioned, studying biology and chemistry. Fundamentally, that was my major and my minor. And yeah, so kind of dropped my chemistry and just kind of started taking a whole bunch of psychology courses. And there started studying clinical psychology and sleep and dreaming and different kinds of elements in neuroscience and all of that kind of thing. But along the way, I suppose there was just this trajectory that, at root, you'd still come back to these questions of, okay, yeah, so we understand, how the brain works or behavior works or whatever, but still the big questions were still always going to be unanswered, always at the root of things. And actually, Ernest Becker had a really interesting quote on that, and kind of to paraphrase him, he said, when you dig deeply all questions end up at the doorstep of religion. And he used the term religion and again, a very big pronounced way to say, those eternal questions, right? That, historically religious traditions have explored. And I think that this is what, one of the fruits of secular humanism, which what, some authors have argued is kind of contemporary framing for exploring religious or spiritual questions or existential questions, as we would use that term now. It's the same enterprise, just with a secular kind of lens around it. And so I think that there's something to that, just that you can get to the day, okay, yeah, so let's say that you've worked on your cognitions or your emotions and you're relatively happy and you're getting through life. You still have to face the question of meaning and what happens when we die. How do we make sense of the death of others and grief and of the tragedies of being? We still have to contend with that, and there's never going to be, again, a final solution to that issue, right? And yeah, so I think that it was always this pervasive undercurrent, just studying across my psychology classes. And yeah, and then eventually it kind of continued on into my graduate studies and looking at the existential and humanistic authors as well, so people like Abraham Maslow as well, Rollo May, James Bugental, and of course Irvin Yalom, Viktor Frankl. So some of these big fixtures in this movement, and that just resonated with me and kind of continued through. And then I became interested in working, hands-on, and so that's what drew me to working in the cancer care world. So psycho-oncology and palliative care, and that was where I really got to see these ideas in practice and see that this approach to psychology, and as you know, Natalie, there's so many different approaches. There's cognitive behavioral psychology, there's psychodynamic psychology. In fact, I think the research suggests that there's something like 500 or more distinct schools of psychotherapy or something like that. And competing interests or different frames and models. And so in that line in psycho-oncology, I really got to see firsthand the importance and the value, where a lot of these other models would be insufficient to deal with someone in a certain crisis. that you needed existential psychology and existential philosophy to give them some kind of buoy, some kind of life raft. So yeah, and so I guess that brings me to where I'm at now as a new professor starting out and continuing my research on some of these topics.
Yes, and I would absolutely love for you to introduce us to some of what you're working on, some of the contributions that you're making at the moment, if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I think, yeah, so as I mentioned kind of in that introduction prelude there, that I'm interested in particularly in death anxiety and death acceptance and how we work with that as an issue that all humans face and that we're all contend with. Irvin Yalom and other number of other thinkers have posited that actually I think the William James put it this way, but it has an even earlier origin, that death is the worm at the core, right? That of all the different issues we deal with freedom, we deal with responsibility, with meaning and meaninglessness and these kinds of things. Isolation, I think, is the other. But that death is kind of the key piece, is that, you know, we come to the end of the road and no one knows what's beyond that final doorway. And so that really, really captivates me. So that's, I'd say, one of the key pieces that I've explored, and it's been a theme in my thinking. But then if that is the kind of question, it's okay, well, how do we work with it, or how do we resolve it? Oh, of course, again, I think that's perhaps arrogant, but how do we contend with it? And so if you look at the works of Erickson, he talks about wisdom as a kind of detached and indifference from death itself. And so that I found very, very interesting in the theories of self-transcendence that come out of sociology, in gerontology, and in the palliative care literature, that the way we contend with death is by essentially trying to transcend our separate egoic selves, by develop a broader and broader and broader understanding of who we are and what we are and what we're all about, expanding our identity in this notion of self-transcendence. And so that ties into notions of psychological developments or psychological growth, the development towards wisdom. So I'm interested in those topics, that by growing in self-transcendence, we help to ameliorate death anxiety and existential anxieties in general. So that's been a part of my work. And then finally, this is where psychedelics come into the mix as well, which is the use of psychedelic compounds to precipitate these self-transcendent experiences. You might have heard of the research areas of compounds to precipitate mystical states of consciousness. So I'm interested in the utility of those to not only help with end-of-life anxiety, which is a paper that will be coming out shortly, that's on this topic, which is the reemergence of the psychedelic research for end-of-life anxiety and existential anxiety as one approaches death. But also across the lifespan, how can these compounds be used to foster psychological developments and to help us interact with the existential challenges that we face? So that's the kind of the three pieces that all interact in my work and in my time in graduate school. My dissertation is on this notion of psychological and psychospiritual development in relation to the very deliberate, judicious, cultivated use of these compounds. And then that opens up a whole other can of worms about, psychoactive substance usage in our society, and a whole host of different kind of things there. But and that's become a bit of a side interest of mine, kind of looking at public health and addictions and those kinds of things as well. So yeah, there's a lot of different moving pieces, but I think that they all kind of really do center around this notion of how do we contend with our lives, with our existence? What is the role of awe and transcendence in that? And what might be the role of these compounds that have seen use for millennia by all cultures that have had access to them in that enterprise? So that's what my research looks at.
Would you mind kind of defining what you mean, or what is meant by the concept of self-transcendence?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So self-transcendence is a term that's used to define two different kinds of constructs in psychology. So on the one hand, we can use it to define a state, a temporary state. And so there's what's been described as the self-transcendent continuum. And so on the low end of that continuum, you actually would put mindfulness. It's been conceptualized as a temporary self-transcendent state. And then as you go up that continuum, you'd get into states of flow. And then as you move further up that continuum, you get to states of awe. And as you get further up that continuum, you get to what Maslow called peak experiences. And then finally, you get to the mystical experiences. And so, okay, so what does that that continuum entail? It entails two phenomenological pieces. So the one piece is the sense of ego diminishment or self-diminishment. And what that means is that your sense of being a self with, all of these important inner thoughts going on and all this self-focus, that really starts to bleed away and you start to lose self-focus, this what's sometimes called ego dissolution. And when we're in states of mindfulness, you can really fall into that. Or if you stay in states of flow as well, the sense of self really kind of moves away and you just kind of get absorbed in the task at hand. Let's say you're, playing a sport or you're listening to a symphony, you can kind of lose yourself in that the self goes away. So that's the first facet. But the other facet of self-transcendence is the sense of connection. So that as you lose yourself, you're merging with something much bigger, much grander, much vaster than you are. So you feel it's almost as if we think of ourselves as waves on the ocean, right? Each of us is an individual wave. Our ego consciousness is an individual wave on this ocean. But when we're in a self-transcendent state of consciousness, we temporarily recognize that, oh my goodness, I'm not a wave, I am the ocean. Or rather, I am part of it, right? And so these terms kind of break down the sense of oneness that we develop in these self-transcendent states. And that is most exemplified in the peak or mystical states where there's a full ego obliteration or ego annihilation, which is sometimes called ego death, where you lose yourself entirely, but you retain consciousness. You're still awake, you're still aware, but there is no I anymore. There's no Kevin with my story of I was this, and when I was a child, I did this. That's all gone. That's just kind of obliterated. And you're just one with kind of the unfolding of experience. So that's a self-transcendent state of consciousness. That term has also been used to define both a static trait or also a developmental trait. And so I alluded to that developmental trait. The static trait would have to do with, again, the extent in which in your daily life you experience a sense of connection. So it's similar to the self-transcendent states, but it's a bit different. It's more your abiding sense of, do you feel connected with others? Do you feel connected with nature and with the trees outside and with the stars up in the sky at night? Do you feel kind of all of this spiritual sense, really would be another way to describe it. So that's part of self-transcendent as a trait, but it's also been described developmentally. So as I mentioned, Abraham Maslow, he described self-transcendence as a developmental tier beyond self-actualization. That as an individual had really developed who they were and who they were meant to become, that now they develop this desire or this need to go beyond that and to kind of dissolve that and to transcend the self that they had developed and created. The same thing with Erik Erikson in his late work, and the work that his wife actually continued after he passed away, looked at self-transcendence as this far rung of development where, again, the self becomes more and more diffuse. You identify with past and previous generations and life unfolding itself with the cosmos, with the unfolding of nature, so that your individual self becomes almost kind of this illusion, if you will, and you see that you're actually part of this great unfolding, this great wave. Lars Tornström is a Swedish sociologist. He also studied this. He called it gerotranscendence, as this developmental process that develops as we go through the life course and the life trajectory. So so self-transcendence as a trait would be this idea of a growing sense of connection and a growing loss of the importance of the individual ego as we develop. So as we can see, there's these overlap with the self-transcendent states, but it is a different process. One is, again, a temporary state. One is more an abiding trait. It becomes more a permanent way of being in the world. And one of the enduring questions in the psychology of these states and traits is, to what extent are those interrelated? So yeah, did that kind of give an overview there?
Absolutely. And I realize it's something that I'm coming across a lot in different ways, but perhaps I've never asked the explicit question, and always it's so valuable. I suppose that's part of what this interview series is also about, is that every time you can ask the same question to many different people and get many different answers. And I really, really valued your answer there. I found it really concise. It makes me think why people strive for these to be in that state, to be in that self-transcendent state. I can imagine when you were speaking there, I was imagining myself just getting lost in music or getting lost in art.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, we've cultivated these states. There's a reason they're so pervasive, and when we look anthropologically, there is tons of evidence that this is why we've used all sorts of technologies to alter consciousness, from fasting, so self-starvation, self-flagellation, inducing pain, and these kinds of things, and of course the use of psychoactive chemicals and plants to try and alter consciousness with the explicit aim of achieving these self-transcendent kinds of states. So there definitely is a precedent there, and the question will be, how do we foster them in a postmodern world, in a world in which the religious traditions that historically, explored these kinds of questions and have fostered these kinds of states, when those are not holding the same sway necessarily that they once did for a lot of people, how do we cultivate these things in a kind of postmodern or meta-modern even way? And I think that that's a really interesting question.
And safely too, because I
Precisely.
suppose, yeah, that's my, when I hear psychedelic, I hear there's a certain amount of fear, because I've heard stories, such terrible stories. Like, how does that work for you in being involved with it, and especially being involved with it in a professional way?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really important point, is that psychedelic substances, and so if we look at psychoactive substances in general, kind of as our starting point, that of course they're mired in controversy, that we use them in very, very restricted ways a lot of times in medicine and psychiatry and these kinds of things, of course, in certain ones. But then there's a whole host of other compounds that have not been granted that legitimacy, or at least not yet, and that is changing. But if we look specifically at the what are called the classic psychedelics, or the serotonergic psychedelics, as they're sometimes called, so this would be drugs like psilocybin or psilocin, which is the active component within magic mushrooms. And then you have LSD, of course, which is just a very, very typically well known. And then mescaline also falls into that category, and dimethyltryptamine, which would be the active component in ayahuasca, which is a notable psychedelic brew or tea from the Amazon in South America. So those are some of the major classic psychedelics. And what the research seems to suggest is that, or not seems to, I think is quite clear, is that these drugs are very, very safe physically. So in terms of the effects on one's physiology and that kind of thing, there's not going to be permanent damage from them by any means. So they're very, very safe in that regard. They're non-addictive as well, which is also a benefit. In fact, they're being used to treat addictions in the context of psychotherapy. So they have anti-addictive properties. However, as you pointed out, Natalie, that they can be incredibly harrowing. The experiences they can produce can be very distressing. They can produce extreme paranoia, extreme distress, the sense you're going crazy, that you're losing your mind, that you're dying, in fact. It's essentially a temporary psychotic-like state that they can induce in some individuals. And so that is their danger, and that really needs to be explored, and more research needs to be done there. The research seems to suggest that they're not going to precipitate a psychological disturbance or a psychiatric disorder in individuals, that don't have any pre-existing history or underlying risks of developing a psychotic disorder in particular. Whereas the research suggests that they may have some danger of an earlier precipitation, let's say, of a psychotic disorder in an individual who's already on that developmental trajectory. So I actually have a paper that I explore some of these themes, where I explore the difference between psychosis and spiritual emergency, which is a term in transpersonal psychology. I'm not sure if you've come across the term spiritual emergency. So yeah, so a spiritual emergency is this kind of transpersonal experience where it can be precipitated by psychedelic compounds. It can be precipitated by intensive meditation practice. They can even be precipitated spontaneously by, being out in nature or just whatever it might be. And there are kind of these awakening experiences that can be very, very distressing, with all sorts of features that really resemble a psychotic-like experience. And these are not uncommon when individuals take very, very high doses of psychedelic drugs as well, or engage in intensive mindfulness meditation practice on certain retreats, these kinds of things. And so there needs to be more research exploring, for who is this going to be safe, and who perhaps should avoid this due to their psychological or their biological attributes or whatever that might be. Yeah.
And how can research on something potentially, I know not physically dangerous, but something potentially spiritually or psychologically dangerous, how is that researched in today's world, ethically and legally?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, today the research on that, in terms of the experimental research that's going on, with all the new studies that are coming up in what's been called the psychedelic renaissance now, where there's a whole host of research going on in the UK at Imperial College London. There's a big research group there in the United States, in the continental Europe, some research going on in Canada. So this is re-emerging now. And the experimental research currently has been very, very strict on screening individuals that have, a history of, say, schizophrenia in the family, that kind of thing. So right now, we're being very careful to just essentially take a very, very conservative approach and say, there's some precedents for this. Some of the earlier research that was done, some of the prospective research that was done suggested that this was an issue. So let's just stay away from that entirely and prevent those individuals from kind of even being involved. So that's one way in which there's protections, and we can do that in terms of the experimental research. We can be very, very strict. But when we look at, well, the many, many individuals that are using these compounds recreationally, or, I think even recreationally sometimes is a loaded term. So if we say using these compounds, let's say for their own personal growth or for their own spiritual development or existential insights or creativity, those individuals who are trying to use them for a very serious and concerted process or purpose, how do we make sure that they're using it safely, or what would be the traits that would be, contraindicated? And the reality is that it's extremely difficult to study individuals that are using compounds that are still prohibited, that we can't really get very clear data. It's all going to be kind of correlational or survey, cross-sectional research. And that really limits our ability. And of course, the ethics of trying to do some of this research experimentally anyways would be off the table. So it puts us in a very, very difficult situation. And yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the answer will be going forward. I think, unfortunately, some of it just is prospective and correlational, but there's tons of flaws, of course, as we know, that come with that kind of research. But for now, it's perhaps some of the best we have as the rules and regulations on these compounds start to change in the coming decades.
And you made the point earlier that this is not, the research is new, but the use of these substances are not new. The desire to self-transcend is not new.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. No. So this research is re-emerging. Of course, it's first started back in Oh, really? I guess the 1950s, although there was some early research in the 1940s when LSD was first synthesized. But really in the 1950s and then in the 1960s, there was the research, and then it was mostly shut down by the end of the 1960s. I think there was small pockets of their use that was allowed to continue in continental Europe. There were some psychiatrists that essentially were grandfathered in to using them, but I don't think the research was conducted until the 90s, and then it slowly started to come in, and now we're seeing this resurgence of interest and changes there to kind of just give a sense of the history of research in kind of more modern psychology and psychiatric context. But yes, this history goes way back. So we have anthropological evidence for the use of all manner of these compounds that goes back many thousands of years. I was looking at one anthropology paper which found these old engravings from North Africa. And the engravings appear to show a psilocybin mushroom. And so these mycologists that I guess are experts on this said, no, that clearly looks like the engraving of a psilocybin mushroom. And again, there's many different species of these mushrooms. But what's interesting about that one, why I point that out, is because this engraving was apparently dated, was found from an era when the Sahara was not yet a desert. So I think that was something like 9,000 BC. So that's very interesting to say that, well, how far back? So could this be, 10, 11,000 years back with just psilocybin? Same thing with ayahuasca in South America, thousands of years. So yeah, they definitely have a role. And in fact, the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, there's a lot of research now coming out. Actually, there was just a book that came out recently, and I'm forgetting the name of it. Excellent. The Immortality Key, perhaps, that the Eleusinian mysteries very possibly involve the use of some kind of substance that was an ergot similar to LSD. And that went on for many hundreds of years, if not a couple millennia, I believe. Don't quote me on that piece, but nonetheless, so it has a big history also in Western culture, in our kind of lineage here as well. So there is a use, and so in some regards, we actually live at a kind of interesting time that there is such a strong prohibition on altering our consciousness in certain ways that, of course, most Western nations we allow ethanol, alcohol, and these kinds of things, but we prohibit other compounds which are physically much safer, but that might produce these states of consciousness that that might have benefits, and that certainly other cultures have seen and used with beneficial intentions for a very long time. So it's interesting, very interesting.
I've never thought about it in that way, this sense that it is we are prohibiting something that's not physically dangerous but could you're discouraging self-transcendence, you're discouraging people's capacity to safely and legally explore these massive realms of their existence which otherwise may not be able to be accessed.
Yeah, no, I think how you just put it is just so beautifully said, is that there is a British author named Graham Hancock, and he's spoken about this at length, this notion that we're not sovereign over our own consciousness, that we have many rights and freedoms and privileges, but if we're not even allowed to take very safe compounds to modulate our own minds with no danger to really ourselves or to society, which should be the major criterion, then are we really free at all? And so I think it's kind of a provocative question, but it is an interesting one. As you said, why are we not allowed to explore the depths of our own mind and to explore our own spiritual journey or existential journey with the aid of these, the way that humans have for so long? And I think part of it is certainly goodwill in the interest of saying, hey, we're trying to protect you. But, as David Nutt, who is another English psychiatrist, I'm not sure if you're familiar with David Nutt. I believe he's also at Imperial College London. He pointed out that there's much hypocrisy, that tobacco and ethanol are legal, and we know that they're physically very harmful and cause all sorts of challenges and and also don't necessarily, I mean, they certainly have their pro-social benefits in terms of socializing and whatnot, and certainly don't want to denigrate them. But if they're illegal, then surely much safer compounds that might have this existential or spiritual value, surely they should have some means of being regulated and legalized as well, especially if all of this research is showing they clearly have all sorts of pro-social benefits and benefits in terms of well-being and existential attunement and these kinds of things. So yeah, there's more to the story in terms of why they are prohibited than just saying it's about our well-being or our safety, I think.
Yeah. Because I suppose, generally speaking, while I've been conducting these interviews, I'm thinking of existence and existential ideas based on, maybe I'll say it wrong, but just your everyday and what you take for almost granted in the natural experience just here, rather than going into those extra levels, which I suppose, even just thinking about existential ideas, it starts to open these doors, these windows into these new potentialities. But
Yeah.
using substances or using meditations or using these journeys that you were speaking about earlier, it raises it to that extra level. It adds to it.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why psychedelic compounds in particular, I think, have utility as existential tools. Actually, there is a Canadian author named Ken Tupper who I believe calls them existential tools, which is, I think, a really provocative idea. It's precisely because they peel away the layers of the normal, to use Timothy Leary's term, the games that we play. So we normally think, oh, I'm this and I have this role, all of the hats, and to use a Jungian term, Carl Jung might have called them our personae, the different masks that we wear, and the stories and the games and the narratives that we play out in the world, where I'm this and I do that and you play that role, and it just kind of dissolves that. And so it puts you face to face with the existential questions. It puts you face to face with the overwhelming awe of existence, to say, what is this? What is going on? What am I? What really, it's that question of questioning, of not knowing. You come up against that wall of your ignorance, you're overwhelmed. And that is a very much an existential feeling. In fact, awe has been described as a self-transcendent or existential emotion. And it's associated with this kind of this creaturely awareness, as Rudolf Otto put it, this sense of, yeah, what am I? What are we doing here? And so kind of it really helps you to be existentially attuned. If that's what you're using them for. Of course, you can use a compound to party or just to get visuals or whatever. But if you're using them for this really judicious, concerted process of wanting to not escape from life, but rather go into life head on and really essentially encounter some of that dread and some of that fear, and be transformed by it, that's absolutely an existential use of these compounds.
And this is a very interesting existential concept for me, about who we are. You were speaking about the roles, and so we, generally speaking, find ourselves with these roles. We are child, we are student, we are X, Y, and Z. And I really enjoy the philosophies and the philosophers who suggest, yeah, but you don't have to be those roles. But even that balance between, or that gap between having the idea and then having the theory, there's a gap there, which I think people find hard to shift. Okay, so I'm sitting here right now, I've got my roles, I'm now told that I don't have to play the roles, but how do I do that? And I think, I don't know, but what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that certain activities, certain self-transcendent activities give you that capacity to dissolve that sense of, yeah, but how, or yes, I must be this because that's who I believe myself to be, and just think, no, it's an open plane. Be creative. What feels right, what feels you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's very well said. And I think that's the value of these compounds, and of a variety of psychoactive compounds, I'm sure, have this capacity, but certainly the psychedelics do, which is, if nothing else, they temporarily show you a different way of being that oh, I don't have to be that way. There are these different ways. There are these different modes of consciousness, of seeing things in different ways, of being in different ways. And particularly with the psychedelics, also shedding that, peeling that onion and helping you realize that, oh, wow, I am not this. I am not that. Those are all constructions. What am I at my core? And of course, you can really, really drill down into that, but it kind of that's that notion of liberation. If you lose all these pieces fall away, and that can be experienced quite frightening. You're like, well, if I'm not that, well, then what am I really? Right. Well, that can be experienced as kind of a scary notion of ego loss or ego death, as it's called in the spiritual literature and certainly in the psychedelic literature. That's not necessarily a pleasant experience per se, but it's a liberating experience. And so then the idea is can we take that understanding that comes in an altered state, and can we now integrate that? Can we reflect on that after the fact and say, what did I learn? What does that teach me about the things I take for granted, the assumptions I have about who I am, and the roles I have to play, the masks I have to wear. And we see that, no, that state proved to me that they're relative, that they're constructions, that they're fluid, and that I can now take that choice, take that leap of faith to behave differently, to be differently, to choose something different. And so I think that if nothing else, that's their powers. They show us the kind of relativity of the normal waking state, as William James would have put it.
What for you has been I know you mentioned before that there was this awe and there was this despair when you had these kind of existential moments and these self-transcendent moments, but what for you is a memorable experience where these philosophies have helped you to overcome something or helped you through a challenge maybe?
Mm. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think at lots of different junctions through my life, they have, as I mentioned earlier, that when I look back over my life, from the time I was just a young little guy, reflecting on these kind of existential questions, why are we here? And so I think that I've always had a bit of, again, to use William James, a bit of that kind of what he would call the sick-mindedness, which is that I've always been aware of kind of the sadness at the core of all of this, the fact that, yeah, life is wonderful, it's amazing, it's beautiful, it's awesome in the truest sense, but it's also terrible. It's also full of suffering and grief and angst and uncertainty. And existential ideas help us to contend with that. They don't paint over that. And that's what I love about it. That's what I find so useful about them, is that they open the door to being authentic and to living fully and to soaking out every last drop from life and being who you are and encountering other people in an honest, true way. They help you do that. But it's precisely because they make you look at the other side of and to say, yeah, grief is real, despair is real, illness is real, tragedy is real, death is real, meaninglessness, that seems real. And I like that it doesn't try to sugarcoat things. It doesn't try to look away. And it's precisely, I believe, by encountering the darkness, if you want to put it in that sense, that we understand the lightness in life as well. That it's more true to our story, to our human condition, that there wouldn't be some future state where all disease has been eradicated, where all issues, Becker actually really contends with this, the denial of death, that he says, right now, let's say a little child dies of some illness. Let's say they're 5 years old and they get some illness and they die. That's an absolute tragedy, right? When you're expected to live 80 or 90 years, let's say nowadays, give or take, which is great. But he's like, imagine in some future world where we had cured so many diseases and these kinds of things, and we now lived and we expected to live 1,000 years or 5,000 years. Now imagine a little 5-year-old boy dies in some accident. They become an even more of a great tragedy, that we've not resolved this, that even if we extend our lives and we can live in machines that live on for 500,000 years, we haven't resolved the problem of death. We haven't resolved the issues of entropy in the universe and all these kinds of things. And so existentialism doesn't purport to resolve the issue, but it just says that we have to contend with them, and that in contending with them, we come to living well. And that's the point. So I think that throughout my life, day to day, I'll feel a kind of malaise or kind of despairing at life, or kind of almost a dysthymic quality, and that the existential ideas tell me that, yeah, that's normal. If we look at this notion of distinguishing between neurotic anxiety and existential anxiety, I find that a very, very useful one. That a neurotic anxiety, of course, is maybe something that's in the world of games and the different abstractions that humans have created, but the existential anxiety is there, and it's always going to be there, and that's okay. And in fact, that existential anxiety can catalyze and fuel your living well, being real. When you're with that person and you want to tell them you love them, tell them you love them, give them a hug, because that could be the last time you see them. You want to do something, go do it, because there's no real meaning to any of this anyway, as far as anyone can tell. There might be, sure. And again, that's why we have to be agnostic on these questions, I think. But as far as, but we can't say for sure one way or the other. So just be real. And so that's why I really like that term. And I use it a lot with my patients in palliative care, memento mori, right? That old Latin was remember death, is that rather than looking away from death and being horrified that now death is looking at you and the skull is on your desk, no, look at it, because that's going to help you to peel away all of the absurdities and all of the falsities of your life that don't make sense and don't resonate with you, that you don't actually have to live that way. So there's actually a lot of power in peering into the abyss, as Nietzsche might say. There's strength that actually comes from that. And so I love the dialect of the existential tradition, that it holds both of those. I don't know if that kind of answered your question, but
how does that actually look like, especially valuable speaking to yourself, who has spent so many years working in palliative care with death, with people really confronting death in a way that perhaps others are not? How does that actually look like, saying to them, yeah, but let's look at death, let's acknowledge death? How does that theory actually manifest for them to actually find hope or peace or
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so this is actually where the notions, I mentioned Rollo May earlier. Rollo May has a really great text called Freedom and Destiny, which I highly, highly recommend. And in that, he talks about the difference between fate and destiny. And he says that fate is essentially all of those things that essentially are the contexts of who you are in your life, that you didn't choose to be born to the parents that you were born to. You didn't choose your genetic structure. You didn't choose anything about your temperament. There's most of what you are in the inertia of your life, you didn't choose. You had no say over. I think that, he derives that from Heidegger, I believe it was his notion of thrownness, that we're all just thrown into being without any choice or any say in the matter. I've actually been reflecting on this lately, because I actually have a 5-month-old son right now, is my first, and thinking about him and just seeing that he's truly in awe and wonder, just like, and a kind of dread at times too, of what is this, right? So children are unbelievably existentially attuned because everything's new. They haven't been habituated to, oh, that's this, that's a car, that's a building, when we should be going, wow, what is that? So anyway, we go back to fate. Fate is all those pieces that you have no control over, and that would include your genetics, and that would include, for many of us, those that would develop cancer. We don't choose that. No one wants that. So that's part of fate, if we are to use that terminology there. And not in the sense of, oh, yeah, this was your fate, this was predestined, that you had, just in the sense that this was kind of the random cards that the universe dealt you, so to speak. And that is your trajectory. And so the existential idea is that rather than just being your fate that you were kind of at the whim of, that you are just kind of going along to look at it, to stare it head on, to look at the implications of it, the fear of it, the anger in it, and embracing all that comes along with it. Now you gain the tiny sliver of choice and of freedom within that, and it's now become your destiny. And so that's one of the really powerful, it kind of seems abstract, but really when you explore this with patients, that it's a kind of exercise in acceptance and surrender, which is also this idea that much of this existence, again, we don't have a choice over. And so we can wrestle with it, but we don't really get anywhere by doing that. And certainly we should change what we can change, of course, absolutely, that goes without saying. But those things that are beyond our power, we have to surrender to, we have to accept. And that when we do that, then paradoxically, we find the freedom that we do have to change things. Okay, so let's say that you perhaps might die earlier than you anticipated. Let's say that you develop cancer in your 40s or your 30s or your 50s or whatever, and you thought that you were going to have a rich, long life. Okay, well, that is not your fate, right? So what now? If that is true, and if we can't look away from that, then what now? How do you want to change the days that you live? How do you want to change how you interact with your brother, your sister, your mom, or your dad, your friends, whatever it might be? Do you want to keep working that job? Do you want to keep whatever it might be? How do you live authentically in the face of those things that have been thrown at you and in your life? And so in that way, it's been very, very powerful. This liberation, this empowerment to individuals. But then also, this is where self-transcendence and awe comes in as well, because awe has to do with encountering the immensity, the vastness of our being. And so that's why it is this existential, this self-transcendent emotion, that it makes us feel very, very small. We're encountering something that we can't. And so it's about taking an experience that would otherwise perhaps be overwhelming and traumatic, let's say, and helping to transform that into something that can be growth inducing, growth inspiring. So this is where also post-traumatic growth comes in. And post-traumatic growth is very similar to the process of self-transcendence, growing through loss. But we can only do that when we encounter the loss head on. And I think existential psychology and existential philosophy gives us the grounding to say, it's okay to be beyond despair. And it's okay to feel unbelievable anger and resentment at the universe and at your fate, that's okay, that there's nothing wrong with you for feeling that way, that's understandable. And now what? Kind of like, oh no, that's not something that we have to fix. That is the default condition of being. Now what? And I think that that's just very liberating. So yeah, I guess that's a roundabout way of getting to that answer.
That we don't have choices, just it for so many things happen around us or to us or with us that are not our choice, but within that we have choices. And to at least understand when we're confronted with a really, really tough fate or a tough experience, that we have to make those choices. And even if that choice is just to sit in despair, it's important that we acknowledge, right, I am using my limited time to be in despair right now, and that's okay, that's my prerogative, that's my right. But do I want to spend this much more time? How much more time do I want to be in despair, or to be in pain, or to be not in awe? And when I'm ready to do that, what do I want to do with my remaining time? What do I want to do?
That's right. That's right. And how you put there, Natalie, it evoked for me Paul Tillich. I'm not sure if you've read any of Paul Tillich's work, an important theologian and kind of existential thinker from a Christian tradition. And he talks about this notion of despair, of course, and the despair of non-being. And what he points out is that even in despair, even in this despairing of non-being, we are affirming being itself, because despair only exists in being. And so that any context is the affirmation of being itself, no matter what it is, no matter how bleak, we are still triumphing over non-being, even in the, does that make sense? Even the kind of the greatest darkness. And I think that there's so much power in that, that we don't have to shy away. We don't have to say that we're broken or that this is wrong, that we can say, no, this is the human condition, and that we, even in our despair, we are being, we are here, and that we are conquering over that. And I find that it's so powerful. And again, so that's another piece that I've used with with patients at times.
And I realize perhaps part of what can make despair feel so overwhelming and so deeply horrific and painful is a sense that it's our despair and that we're alone in that despair. And indeed, this is where perhaps existential ideas can also be helpful, because so many of them really iterate that we are in a world of others. We are always in a world of others. And if we allow ourselves to draw on the people around us, then that can be so incredibly valuable about helping us in those really dark, difficult times.
Absolutely, and that brings to mind for me the work of Kristen Neff. I'm not sure if you've heard of Kristen Neff's work and self-compassion, right? And that's one of her facets of self-compassion, as far as I understand, is this notion of our shared humanity. That you aren't alone in that, and that's one of the beauties of the existential tradition as well. Is that no, I mean we're all going to die. We're all going to encounter illness and loss and despair. That's our birthright as humans, and that's okay. And that again, that doesn't mean that something is wrong with you or that you're alone in this. That we're all in the suffering together, and again, that should lead to self-compassion and compassion for others as well, as what she would purport. And I definitely think that there's something to that notion, but it's a very, very much so an existential one, and a powerful one. And it speaks to what I really liked from acceptance and commitment therapy, with Steve Hayes, has this notion of how does he put it? It has to do with normality. Oh yes, the myth of healthy normality. This idea that the baseline state should just be a kind of hedonic well-being, that you should be happy all the time, and that if you're not, that there's something wrong with you. That if you're, kind of mildly down and depressed at times, that, okay, you need to be on medications, you need to be on drugs, because you should just be normally happy. That is so again, the myth of healthy normality. And he and the other authors in acceptance commitment therapy really kind of take that to task. And I agree with that, very much so. And that's, again, another existential idea that, no, this doesn't make sense. That sure, there's, again, to use that old term, neurotic anxiety, that perhaps those should be investigated and looked at and work with. But the existential anxiety, that at the core, that you can't get rid of, that's going to be with you, and that's just a part of our human story, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing. That is what engenders the creation of art and of trying to better things in the world, and to be kind to others and those kinds of things. That it's precisely in being aware of that. I think that's what Kristen Neff is getting at, that being aware of our own suffering, embracing that, really helps us to understand compassion for others and these kinds of things. And so it's not something to get rid of, it's something to understand, to harness and use.
For someone that might be watching this now and really struggling with something despairing or something horrendous or something really painful, what not advice, but what kind of guidance might you give them, for how these existential ideas can really be practically applied to their life, to their well-being?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, it's difficult because I think it's going to be unique and personalized for everyone, of course. But I think a lot of it does come back to this sense of trying to find a way to transform it into a sense of awe, that this is even happening at all. This sense of wonder. And of course, I don't mean that as any kind of platitude. That obviously suffering is real, pain is real. These things are terrible. But I think that, again, if we start with that notion that's okay, that the first piece to dispel this idea that there is necessarily something wrong with you, that you're broken, that you're the alone in this or isolated in this, as you alluded to first really try to dispel that, to say that no, it's okay, that feeling sad about why am I here, or maybe you've lost a loved one, or maybe you're contending with some chronic illness or whatever it might be, that to feel kind of sad and despairing about that's okay. And that from that perspective, then trying to look at and trying to find the awe in that, the wonder in that, the fact that this is even happening at all, and really trying to zoom out to a really broad perspective. somewhat paradoxically, actually, what I've used with a number of my patients and clients, and what I found useful in my own life is the work of Carl Sagan, actually, the late astronomer, who really gave us this sense of the vastness of space and the smallness of our lives, and yet the wonder of this unfolding universe. And so trying to put oneself in that perspective of, wow, this is really happening. This is unfolding. I am part of all of this. And I'm not alone in this, despite what I feel that I'm going through right now. So those would be some of the themes that I'd want to explore, but it is difficult without, without actually working with an individual personally just to see kind of what they're going through. Yeah, so I think that would be kind of some of my kind of initial takes on that would be the normalizing from an existential perspective of these things, and then, yeah, trying to, how do we transform it? And I really do, I believe, Kirk Schneider is an American psychologist that's explored this theme of awakening to awe as a way of kind of counterbalancing, not getting away, not saying that we can get rid of the suffering and despair, but how do we take it and transform it into something where it's catalyzing us to live in a way, or make the smallest of changes in our lives, whatever that might be. So yeah, that's probably what I would suggest.
There are some great terms, aren't they, coined by these guys in our field, like spiritual emergency, and what were you saying there, awakening to awe. There are some really great terms. Now, you have mentioned a massive library of books, which I hope maybe you might send me some of them afterwards that I might be able to list below the video for anyone that is interested in looking into them. But also, you mentioned art. Like, what other forms, music and art, and any other avenues that people could look into to enjoy and explore these ideas, but perhaps not just from reading or academia?
Yeah, absolutely. So so absolutely, music, art. Otto Rank talked about in one of his famous books, Art and the Artist, and he talks about this notion of how do we essentially work with our existential condition, is essentially what he's getting at. And he says that the answer is to become an artist, essentially, or that is the highest calling that we can do. And he doesn't mean that in the sense of becoming a professional artist. He means it in a much more profound way, I think, which is that we all have to create art, metabolize the experiences of our lives, transform them through art of our own creation. And that can take on many, many different forms. This is really at root the basis of much art therapy as a construct, is how do you take your being in this world, your experiences, your unique pain or trauma or circumstances, and transform it into something that's beautiful and that's meaningful, that speaks to who you are and what you're going through and what you're all about. And the key, as Carl Jung pointed out in some of his discussions on this topic, is that it doesn't have to be quote unquote good. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It doesn't have to be, something that you would show. In fact, it has to be just authentic to you. And then, in fact, in art therapy, I believe they suggest that if you are really proficient at a given medium, let's say you're good at drawing or painting, that if you want to use art in a therapeutic process, that you don't use that medium, precisely because your left brain, you're going to intellectualize it, you're going to critique it. The idea is that it's not supposed to be about being good or doing something that you show off and be proud of. It's supposed to be a personal process that you show no one. At sometimes with some art therapists, that you don't even show the therapist, because it's not about that. It's about this inner process. And so that's what I would encourage people, is in any which way that they can engage with some kind of art, to really dig into their process. And maybe it doesn't even mean making their own art. Maybe it means listening to music and really having the emotions be evoked by that. Anything that could activate kind of the right brain processes more, to use kind of Ian McGilchrist has a really great text on this, The Master and His Emissary, which kind of explores the differences there. So anything that you can use to evoke the right brain, generally music, art, being in nature, being in vast, beautiful landscapes, these kind of things. those are all going to be great windows to, yeah, this kind of uh, this non-abstracted, non-intellectualized world. Viktor Frankl, I believe, spoke about the creation of meaning and the different ways that we can kind of create meaning. And one of the ways is by, creating great works of art. And one of the ways is by how we respond to tragedy. But the second way he described actually is how we, or the experiences that we have. And I think he actually talked about listening to a beautiful piece of music or encountering art, that kind of thing. And so just taking it in, being present with it, trying to reflect on that can be very, very therapeutic, and that it gives us this window into, yeah, the immense mystery of what we're all about, that we can't just abstract everything and put everything into words. And that kind of sitting in that space, there can be a real kind of beauty that can come with that. So yeah, art is definitely something that I encourage. Poetry, prose, whatever it might be, that can all be very, very powerful for sure. And yeah, and as I mentioned, being in nature, of course, that's a huge, huge piece as well, for a variety of reasons. There's a whole bunch of psychology on that too. Trying to get out of just the intellectual abstractions.
Because to be human is to be mystery, it is to be mysterious, it is to be whatever you want it to be. And I think I've never framed it in quite that way before, but we do tend to intellectualize the process with which that we create ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's trying to get back to some of that rawness of being. And again, I think that this comes full circle with some of this discussion of self-transcendence and of the use of psychoactive compounds to do this in a responsible way, which is to peel away all of these assumptions, all of the games, all of the beliefs, the really kind of calcified notions of who we are and how we have to think about ourselves and the world, the stories that we have, the self-narratives, to really challenge those and to break those down. And yeah, different kinds of ways of getting out of that headspace: art, music, religious experience, trance, drumming, psychoactive compounds. These have all had an immense history for a reason. And it's about finding ways to bring that back in, bring back in the mystery, as you said, the mystery of our being here. And the fact that we create these models, our mind creates these maps and these frameworks to try to understand and make sense of everything, but they're always and forever going to be limited. And having that humility, that understanding that that's the truth and that that's okay. And it is again, it's liberating to say, how am I going to construct myself anew today, or in this interaction today with this individual, or from moment to moment, in fact. And that's really what existential psychology is about, is the choice in those moments. Again, there's inertia there, but where can we find the choice? Where is that sliver of opportunity there?
And in that metaphorical way, it's not about the size of the canvas, it's not about how long we necessarily have left on earth in this existence, but it's what we choose to do with it. We can have incredible works of art, as it were, incredible existences which only last a tiny, tiny amount of time, but they can still be meaningful. They can still be meaningful for ourselves, for others, and for people beyond, no matter how big or long or small or short they are.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's right. And that gets back to a metaphor that I've often used with patients in palliative care, in psycho-oncology, is that, there are many wonderful novels out there that are very, very short. And that the length of the book, or as you said, the size of the canvas, that doesn't dictate the profound nature of a given story or a given piece of work. That's irrelevant, in the same way that there's huge novels that are really not the best reads, right? And so that the length of size doesn't, impact the profundity of a life or one story, and that it's, yeah, you can only live yours. And so it's really about taking that, seizing it by the horns, so to speak, and to live it. And the kind of the deconstructionism that comes with a lot of existential psychology, it can be frightening to peel these things away. But again, that's the liberating piece, is that oh, you're groundless, that seems scary, but it's also liberating. It's like, no, you can therefore create your own story. You don't have to go about living and assuming all of these yeah, stories or tales or narratives that were handed down to you, that they can, or rather, not even that, even the ones that you constructed and you, I mean, kind of more even unconsciously, that we're indoctrinated with just by the function of, our guardians or parents or whoever, our teachers. Growing up, we come to develop this self story, this self concept, but that itself is relative. That can be challenged, that can be changed. You don't have to keep subscribing to that self narrative. That all also ties into an existential frame, and is again very powerful. It can be somewhat disorienting, but also liberating. And so that's the power of that.
And for me, this has been an incredibly powerful conversation. I have been aware that there's distractions such as grass cutting and Wi-Fi flickering in and out, but I've just been so captivated. And I suppose what I'm left with is just the value of allowing yourself to experience awe, because we can't take for granted that life is awe-inspiring. It's very easy to forget that, or to be distracted from that, or to be too busy or too in pain or too anything to realize that it's really incredible that right now we're here in this moment and we have this existence, however long it might last.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's the key right there, is that, yeah, if you just look around you, this is truly mysterious. It's truly grand. And that the fact that this is happening at all somehow makes it okay. And again, that's not to say that pain is not real. Again, that despair is not real, but yet somehow this is happening. This is happening at all. That we are, again, to go back to Carl Sagan, that we are literally the universe coming to know itself. And that's not a metaphor. That's like a literal truth, at least as far as physics and natural science and chemistry would tell us, that we are truly made of stars, and now we are conscious of our being, right? And I can't think of anything more profoundly existential than that, or more spiritual than that, if you will. And yeah, there's again, it doesn't get rid of these things, but it helps us to live steadfastly and with a sense of equanimity and balance in the face of them, when we allow ourselves to cultivate that sense of wow, of wonder, that enchantment.
I think this is an incredibly beautiful note to end today's interview on, but I do want to pass it over to you to see if there was anything else that you fancied contributing.
I think we covered a lot of bases here, Natalie. I suppose I would just like to, yeah, thank you for your time and for the lovely interview. It's always great to kind of, yeah, to get the juices flowing in terms of these concepts and stuff like that. And you had some great questions and great responses as well too, that got me kind of thinking down some different paths. So thank you very much.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Kevin. Thank you so much as well.
Thank you.